What's up everyone, welcome back. If this is your first time here, my name is Saul Lopez and I am an award-winning content creator, and I post videos every Tuesday sharing some of the knowledge that I have gained over the last 4 years of doing so. Today's video is going to be 10 tips for sports videography, and if you haven't seen my original video, 5 tips for sports videography, I'm going to link it right here. The way I'm going to format this is more of a question and answer. There's a lot of questions that have been asked on different sports videos that I've made on my channel. Just wanted to compile some of the more frequently asked questions, and hopefully this helps you out on your journey as a sports videographer. So let's get right into it. All right, so the first question that we have is, I only have a camera and I don't have a gimbal. What do you suggest? So the majority of my sports videography videos are shot handheld. It really depends on my ability to maneuver and what I can bring. For example, if I'm shooting a basketball game, an organized basketball game, I'm likely not bringing my gimbal. So in this example, all my basketball shots are handheld. So I try to keep a steady hand as much as possible, and I also shoot in a higher frame rate, so 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, in order for me to be able to slow down my footage in the editing room. So whenever I'm editing, if you shoot in those higher frame rates, you can do slow motion, so that helps out a lot. When I'm shooting football workouts, I know I have a little bit more time, I have a lot more space to maneuver, so I will bring my camera gimbal from time to time. So depending on your setup, I shoot on a DJI Ronin S. I throw my Sony on there, and depending on how close I can get, I zoom in and out. I like to get some of those smooth shots just to throw that into the edit, and it's not always just like handheld or like just steady shots, but I think having a gimbal really helps out just because you can add some smooth motion into your video. However, if you can't afford a gimbal because they are expensive, or you just don't have one and you're going handheld, a tip that I suggest is using your neck strap of your camera as kind of an anchor point. You can kind of extend your camera all the way out so that it's steady, and then just kind of go from side to side. You can go top down, and then even if you're doing like a little crab walk, you can kind of keep it steady and then throw some more stabilizer on in Premiere Pro. If you don't have a gimbal, don't worry about it. I like to bring a gimbal if I can, but it's definitely not a requirement. Moving on to the second question, do I shoot all my footage in 60 frames per second or both 60 and 24? If you're just starting out and you're you're at the beginning and you don't know about frame rates, or 24 frames per second or 60 frames per second, in the most basic way, when you're shooting a video is basically just a series of photos that becomes animated and gives you what you know as a video. Whenever you hear someone say shooting in 24 frames per second or 60 frames per second, that's exactly what it means. So for every second of video that you're shooting, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you will have 24 photos within that 1 second of you shooting. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, that means your camera is now capturing 60 frames or stills or photos within every second of video. So if you see your favorite sports videographer or just videographer in general, and you see that their videos are in slow motion, your camera needs to be able to shoot in 60 frames per second so that you can slow that down within your editing software to a 24-second frame rate timeline, and that'll give you a smooth slow motion type feel. So if you want to shoot slow motion, make sure your camera, go into your settings and see if it has 60 frames per second. If you can shoot up to 120 frames per second, that's even better because it'll just be a little bit more epic. When I'm shooting a workout, a basketball game, a boxing session, whatever, I like to shoot the majority of my footage in 60 frames per second, so a higher frame rate. The reason for that is athletes are moving really fast. Basketball, football, boxing, the motions are just extremely intense, very quick. And by having the ability to shoot in slow motion, you can slow all that footage down, and you can really analyze and see the detail of all their movements, whether that's footwork, dribbling, a slam dunk. If you're boxing, if you're throwing a football, if you're catching a football, you can really lock in on that player's concentration, their real technical skill. So I think shooting in 60 frames per second is always very key. However, I also shoot some of my footage in 24 frames per second, because if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, it makes the audience feel like they were there. It's more of a real-time in-person type atmosphere, and it shows the intensity. So if you're shooting in 24 frames per second, it's just like being there, and I think that translates well through your video. So for me, I would say my split is about 85% 60 frames per second and 15% 24 frames per second. So yes, the majority of the footage that I shoot in is in 60 frames per second. Moving right along. So the next question comes from Morgan Hart. His or her question, sorry, Morgan, could be either one. How do you shoot your videos vertically? What is your technique? I have only shot my sports footage in landscape and would love to switch to portrait mode, but not sure how. Morgan's question is basically, how do I shoot my videos in a vertical format? Think of your Instagram story, think of an Instagram feed. If you're seeing this video behind me, it's in a 4:5 aspect ratio, which I reformatted for an Instagram feed because it takes up more space on someone's timeline and it gets a little bit higher engagement from what studies have shown. I don't shoot my videos vertically, so I'm not shooting with my camera this way while I'm doing video. My entire videos are shot just regularly in landscape mode or 16:9 on your camera. I don't know of any cameras that can shoot in 9:16. You could do it by literally just filming everything like this, but it kind of limits you if later on you want to use that 16:9 for like YouTube and you want to take up the whole screen, because then you're just left with that vertical shot that you shot in person. So I don't recommend necessarily shooting in vertical because you kind of eliminate the possibility of using that footage down the line. So what I do, and I will show you here, is within Premiere Pro, depending on what I need to make my video for, I will either set my timeline to 9:16 or I'll switch it to 4:5. Those are usually the two formats that I'm reformatting my video for, because either TikTok, that's 9:16 ratio, Instagram stories is also the same, and as I mentioned before, Instagram feed is 4:5. So feel free to copy my settings from my Adobe Premiere Pro screenshot here if you are looking to do that. But no, I don't shoot everything vertically. I shoot all my videos in landscape mode and then I reformat it within Premiere Pro depending on what I am shooting that project for. Next question is, what camera do you usually shoot with? All my YouTube videos, all my Instagram videos that I get hired to shoot with a client, I am shooting it on my Sony a7R Mark III. So I've had this camera since about 2019. I might be upgrading soon, who knows. I've been shooting on the Sony a7R Mark III. Originally, I started on Canon. My very first camera was the Canon EOS SL1. It was like a little $300 camera that I got off of Amazon. And I learned everything on that. And then once I started shooting more, seeing different people's styles, what I was doing, what I wanted to accomplish within my videos, I felt that the Sony mirrorless cameras were the best option for me. May not be the best option for you depending on what look you're going for, but I prefer the Sony line to anything else when I'm shooting for social media. However, if I am being hired to shoot on bigger productions, I've shot with companies like Under Armour before. I've shot with Ladder Sport, which is owned by LeBron James. For shoots like that, I'm usually renting out higher end equipment. So I'll also shoot on the Canon C200, which is more of a cinema level camera. I've also shot on the Red Komodo camera. So it really depends on the project and what the scope of it is. But if an athlete hits me up and they just want me to come shoot a workout or whatever it is, I am shooting on my Sony a7R Mark III. It shoots in 4K at 24 frames per second. I can shoot in 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second. I can shoot photos really well in higher resolution. Sony are the best. And if you are having to shoot in the evening or in a gym where the lighting may not be as great, Sony cameras are really good in low light. That's one of their higher end specialties and that's what they're really known for. So if it's a little darker wherever you're shooting, the Sony cameras are going to capture that a lot better than your traditional Canon or Nikon cameras, unless you have artificial lighting that you can bring in. Then in that case, go wild with any camera that you want. But if you have no lighting, dealing with low light, Sonys are my go-to camera. Next question that we have is, what shutter speed do you recommend, or do I recommend? Again, it really depends on a number of things. First thing is whether you are shooting in 24 frames per second or 60 frames per second. So the rule of thumb, if you're shooting in either 24 or 60, is you want to double your frame rate for your shutter speed. So if you are shooting at 24 frames per second, you want to shoot at a minimum of 1/50 shutter speed. And if you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you want to shoot at a minimum of 1/125 shutter speed. That does not mean that you cannot go below that. It just means that your frame rate or your video will look a little choppier because there's less frames that are being captured than required. Rule of thumb, that's the first thing. Your shutter speed should be double whatever frame rate that you're shooting at. However, the exception is if, depending on your lighting, depending on if you're outside or indoors, whatever it is, if the sun is blaring down on your subject, you can adjust your shutter speed to go higher or lower depending on what you want your look to go for. However, you could also adjust your f-stop to let less light into your camera. For me, I always like to shoot at a shallow depth of field, f2.8, just because I really enjoy that blurry background look. So I will manipulate my shutter speed in order to compensate for my low aperture. If you have a higher shutter speed, that means that there will be less motion blur with your subject. If you notice, obviously a football player will be running really quickly. If you have a high shutter speed, that means that there will be less blur within their movements. However, you're shooting at a lower shutter speed, you'll get a little bit more motion blur with their quick actions that they have. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It is literally whatever you prefer and whatever you want your style to be, go for that and do that. So it's just a lot of trial and error. But for me, I will shoot at a higher shutter speed depending on my lighting, because again, I'm leaving my f-stop at 2.8. So in order to compensate for that, I have to increase my shutter speed significantly, especially if I'm shooting at like 11 o'clock in the morning, right when the sun is in the middle of the sky. My shutter speed is going to be pretty high. So again, no right or wrong answer here. It's just whatever looks best for you, or depending on if you're shooting for somebody and they have a very specific look that they're going for, then you should try to compensate for that. But minimum rule, always shoot double your frame rate and you should be good to go. This one actually comes from Instagram. So the question is, when you are shooting basketball videos and are following the ball, are you looking through the back of the LCD screen / monitor? Or are you looking up and following it and moving the camera with your head? If you're shooting basketball specifically, and really, this goes for anything, I'm always looking at my screen or monitor. If I ever do decide to peek up and lift my head to see like whatever else is happening, it's not because I need to shoot. I'm just kind of trying to get some awareness of my surroundings and see, if there's anything bigger that's happening. But usually, if you're shooting a basketball game or you're shooting a workout, like you should be focused in on your subject, unless you're getting some B-roll, maybe someone's arriving and you want to get them, and if they're a bigger name. But yeah, every time that I'm shooting looking at my monitor. So I personally don't have an external monitor. I know some people will attach some external monitors to the hot shoe on top of their camera, or they'll have a gimbal where they'll have like a little extra arm with an LCD screen. Honestly, I'm sure that would be very beneficial, but for me, I don't know. I've just gotten used to shooting just by looking at my little LCD screen monitor on the back of my Sony. So that's all I do. I'm making sure that I want to look at my screen just because that's what my frame is going to be. So if you're not looking at your screen and you're looking up and trying to like follow the motion with that, you're not going to be able to know what your framing is. And once you get into your editing room, it might just look trash and you might have completely missed the play. I'm always looking at my screen to make sure that my framing of my image is what I want it to be based on my style and what I like to see. If you do decide to peek up or look up, it should just be to get some awareness, or if you want to maybe try another angle and you're trying to get somewhere else, that's the only reason you should be looking up. But for me, I recommend to look at your screen or your external monitor that you have with you. For keeping your hands as stable as possible, do you have an external grip, or do you have your arms tucked into your body and the camera strapped on for different points of contact? Yeah, so it kind of just depends. So if I'm going handheld, as I mentioned earlier, yes, I love to use my camera strap because that way you can anchor your camera, extend your arms, and then you kind of just have this very smooth swivel point that you can get a little bit of motion if you don't have a gimbal, as mentioned before. However, I also will, if I don't have my camera strap and I'm kind of just having a static shot, I will also tuck my elbows into my sides just to get those points of contact, and then it'll just keep my camera a little steadier. I'll hold my camera grip with the right hand and then the base of my lens with the left hand, and then if I have to zoom in or out, then I can do that there. But it just kind of keeps it a little steadier and you're not moving as much. You might notice you might have like a little bit of shaky hands, or if you're like nervous or whatever it is, your first time shooting, you might have a little bit of shake, but the more comfortable you get with it, the easier that you can get it to be a little bit stable. And again, if you shoot in slow motion and you're editing within Premiere Pro or any other editing software, they should have some sort of warp stabilizer that kind of can smooth your footage out, but I would not rely on that warp stabilizer plugin just because it can give you a really wonky stabilization, especially if your footage isn't steady to begin with already. Then you should really try to do it in camera as much as possible. All right, next question. Are you pulling focus or do you use autofocus? Camera terminology here, if you're just beginning out, pulling focus means that you are manually focusing your camera lens and your shot. So that means that your focus ring, you're moving it based on the action that you're seeing. For sports, it's pretty difficult to do this because it's hard sometimes to judge the distance. Athletes, again, moving super fast. So my Sony has really, really good autofocus. I rely on that autofocus like crazy, especially for sports, just because it's one less thing to worry about. If you have a bigger camera setup and it's more of a production on set, you usually have a role, a position, someone who is known as the first AC or as the first camera assistant, and their job is to pull focus for you. So for example, if you're shooting on a red camera, red cameras don't have autofocus. The red Komodo, the newest one, does have a beta autofocus. However, it's not super reliable. So cinema cameras, you do need someone to be pulling focus via an external monitor, or you could as well be manually focusing the camera with you, but it could be a lot. But I know people that do it, so it's definitely not outside of the realm of possibilities. For my social media work, my content that I'm doing, I just use autofocus just because it's a little bit easier than having to be manually focusing everything at the same time. I lost count of what number we're on, but I think this might be number 9. So hopefully I'm not jipping you guys out of an extra tip. But this question, before filming, do you want to have an idea of what you want the video to look like to make it easier in the editing process along with the song choice? Or does it just kind of depend? It depends on the project, obviously. Like if you're shooting for a big company, there's going to be a lot of pre-production where the client will be like, we need to use this song. This is a look we're going for. They'll send you examples of other companies' work, of styles that they want to go for. So once you have that in your head, you can kind of just approach it in that way. For maybe your personal work and you're just kind of doing it for fun or trying something different, I would say just experiment. If it's personal work, there's really less expectation as to what you have to do, just because you can try out new things, you can try out new effects, and it doesn't really matter if it's a corporate work because those tend to not be as effect heavy depending on who you're working with. Whatever I'm going into, I always like to have an idea of what I am going for. So if I'm shooting a workout or if I'm shooting like a Sierra Canyon basketball game, I like to get that content out almost immediately, like within 2 to 3 hours after I'm done shooting with it. So I know that I'm gonna go for more of a raw, natural sounding edit. So I'll use a lot of sound effects, things that I'll just capture with while I'm shooting. Going into it, I know that it's going to be a little bit more of a documentarian feel. I just want people to feel like they were there and just something quick that I can send to the athletes that I'm working with. So I know that going into it, I'm just going to be shooting some of my regular shots. I have my go-to angles that based on, trial and error and shooting different things that I like to go to, and then I'll do that. However, sometimes if I'm going with a more involved edit and I'm working with an athlete, maybe I'll ask them to send me a couple of song choices that they've been listening to recently before the workout, just so I have that in my head. A lot of athletes, if you're shooting a workout, they'll be playing music while you're there, and sometimes you'll notice they're vibing out to one song a little bit more. So it's like, oh, okay, I'll probably use that song in my edit. It really just all depends. I like to just follow my feeling, whatever I'm feeling that day, as far as like my mood or energy. I'll just basically follow that. But sometimes I'll be digging through music samples or different songs, and I'll find a song that really, really sticks, and then I'll be like, wow, this would be really cool to edit this to, and then I'll throw that in editing, and then I'll kind of build my edit around there. I would say always be open-minded. Don't be married to one idea, because maybe you'll start doing it, you'll notice that it's not really working out, and you'll want to maybe switch it up a little bit. So always be flexible with it. Don't be super stubborn about it, because I would say 9 out of 10 times your final vision isn't always what you originally planned for, so it could change from time to time. So be open with it. If this isn't 10, I'll make another video down the line with some more tips. Final question is, what editing software do I use? And as I mentioned before, I edit everything within Adobe Premiere Pro. I invested in Adobe Premiere Pro from the very beginning. I know people use Final Cut. A lot of more people have been using DaVinci Resolve as of late. But even if you only have iMovie, can't afford an editing software, start with iMovie because it can take you places. I'm sure there's a bunch of different iPhone apps as well that you might be able to edit in. But yeah, for me, I edit on a MacBook Pro and I use Adobe Premiere Pro. Hopefully that was helpful. Those were 10 frequently asked questions that I've been getting on different videos here on YouTube or on my Instagram. Feel free to leave any other questions down below if there's anything unanswered, anything that you want to know additionally. How to get clients, how to develop pre-production, how to create a mood board, whatever it is. Leave them in the comments below. DM me on Instagram at Saul Lopez. Love hearing from all of you. Feel free to send me your work too. If you have any questions and maybe you want some feedback on different videos that you've been making, feel free to send me those via Instagram, and I'm more than happy to take a look and chop it up with you. But thank you so much for watching. I really hope this was helpful. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Keeps me motivated to make these videos, and I will see you next Tuesday. Hope you're staying safe out there. Thanks so much.
I might just hit it through. That's on my element. I like dark skins, love a melanin, pump, pushing the tongue when I'm stepping in.